60 Now, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The new head of CBS News, Bari Weiss, is facing growing criticism after she abruptly canceled a segment on 60 Minutes about Venezuelan immigrants who were tortured in El Salvador's Secat mega prison after being sent there by the Trump administration. CBS announced the segment had been pulled 3 hours before the broadcast Sunday, after Weiss requested multiple changes and reportedly urged 60 Minutes to include an interview with Trump advisor Stephen Miller, who has orchestrated Trump's immigration crackdown. On Monday, Weiss told colleagues at CBS, "I held that story because it wasn't ready," unquote. CBS correspondent Sharon Alfonsi, who reported the segment, wrote an internal note criticizing the decision. She noted that her team had requested comment from the White House, the State Department, and the Department of Homeland Security. Alfonsi wrote, quote, "If the administration's refusal to participate becomes a valid reason to spike a story, we have effectively handed them a kill switch for any reporting they find inconvenient," unquote. Alfonsi went on to write, quote, "Our story was screened 5 times and cleared by both CBS attorneys and Standards and Practices. It's factually correct. In my view, pulling it now, after every rigorous internal check has been met, is not an editorial decision. It's a political one," she wrote. The controversy comes less than 2 months after Bari Weiss was installed as editor-in-chief of CBS News. In October, she sold her right-wing digital media outlet, The Free Press, to CBS's new parent company, Paramount Skydance. Paramount's biggest shareholder is the billionaire Larry Ellison, a close ally to Trump. Paramount CEO is Ellison's son, David, who installed Weiss in her post. Democratic Senator Ed Markey of Massachusetts said in a statement, quote, "This is what government censorship looks like. Trump approved the Paramount-Skydance merger. A few months later, CBS's new editor-in-chief kills a deeply reported story critical of Trump. A sad day for 60 Minutes and journalism," unquote. Bari Weiss made the decision to hold the segment, even though CBS had already begun promoting the story online.
Began as soon as the planes landed. The deportees thought they were headed from the U.S. back to Venezuela, but instead they were shackled, paraded in front of cameras, and delivered to CCOT, the notorious maximum security prison in El Salvador, where they told 60 Minutes they endured 4 months of hell.
Did you think you were going to die there?
We thought we were already the living dead, honestly.
The full episode was actually streamed in Canada because CBS sent the finished piece to its Canadian distributor before the segment was spiked. Many media commentators have noted Bari Weiss's decision to hold the segment came shortly after President Trump publicly criticized CBS on Friday.
But NBC is really bad. And CBS, I mean, I love the new owners of CBS. Something happens to them, though. 60 Minutes has treated me worse under the new ownership than they just keep treating me. They just keep hitting me. It's crazy.
We're joined now by Alexa Koenig, co-faculty director of the Human Rights Center at the University of California, Berkeley, where she is also a research professor of law. Alexa Koenig was interviewed for the unaired 60 Minutes piece talking about her students' research into human rights abuses in El Salvador's Secat mega prison. The Human Rights Center's Investigations Lab recently aided Human Rights Watch in its report on Secat titled, "You Have Arrived in Hell: Torture and Other Abuses Against Venezuelans in El Salvador's Mega Prison." Alexa Koenig, thank you so much for joining us in this first interview since the 60 Minutes story was spiked. If first, as you are both a professor of law and also teach in the journalism school, can you talk about the significance of this story being spiked?
I'd be happy to, and thanks so much for having me this morning. One of the things that the Human Rights Center at UC Berkeley is really committed to is training a next generation of students, whether they're journalism students, law students, or otherwise, how to find facts in online digital spaces, how to assess the quality of that information. We know that online places can be rife with propaganda and other mis and disinformation, and getting that truth, those facts out to the public. One of the first tenets of ethics in journalism is, of course, to seek truth and report it. That is something that we really try to ingrain in our students and to make sure that that doesn't follow along political lines, but that there's a fidelity to finding those facts and to getting them out as broadly as possible. When this story was spiked, that was, of course, incredibly disappointing, given the extraordinary amount of work that was done by Human Rights Watch and its partners, also by our student investigation team, who'd been working pretty much around the clock for several weeks to pull together some of the digital content that could be used to corroborate or potentially disprove what the individuals who've been released from Saykot prison had said they'd experienced while in captivity. So I think that this is a big moment for American politics. It's a big moment for getting facts and truth out to the public about what has been done in their name, what is being done with taxpayer dollars. And I do think this is a story that eventually needs to come out.
So if you can explain exactly what this story was. I mean, you have Sharon Alfonsi responding in an internal memo to the spiking of the story by Bari Weiss, installed by Paramount, the father and son, Larry and David Ellison, close allies of President Trump, saying that there should have been interviews with the Trump administration. And yet you have the producer of the piece saying they repeatedly asked different departments from Homeland Security to the Trump administration to respond, and they didn't. And that if you followed that rule, anytime a government didn't want a story to be aired, they would just say no.
I can't speak to, of course, what happened within 60 Minutes or the exact contents of the show, but what I can certainly speak to is the kinds of work that was being done and the very careful reporting and investigation for the Human Rights Watch report that had come out fairly recently before the segment was being investigated and reported. One of the things that we really tried to support Human Rights Watch on was figuring out how they could corroborate or fill in gaps in their reporting through digital open source information. One of the things that we built with the United Nations Human Rights Office was something called the Berkeley Protocol on Digital Open Source Investigations. Those are the global standards for how to do digital investigations responsibly, fairly, and with an eye towards ethics. And so one of the pieces we did was we pulled together a number of videos that had been posted to YouTube and other places online. A lot of times influencers had been invited into Saykot prison, and they had gathered video imagery of the internals of this particular facility. This is one of the most locked down prisons in the world. One of the things that I think Human Rights Watch was really trying to make sense of is what is the layout of that prison? What is Module 8? What does that look like? What does it contain? What kind of water did these men have access to? What kind of light sources did these men have access to? And whether that met international standards for people's human rights being protected. And so by taking hours of video footage and really breaking it down screen by screen and analyzing the content of that imagery, we were able to piece together a picture of Saykot prison that could be basically investigated in parallel with the testimonies of the men who'd recently been released. I think very importantly, we did not have access to those testimonies. That is, I think, a really important component of this story, because it meant that we were not being biased by these very human narratives that are such compelling narratives when you finally do have a chance to see them, but that we were able to kind of build from the ground up, almost literally, from satellite imagery of the earliest construction of the prison to these internal videos, what the conditions were like that these men had been held in.
Can you talk more about what you and the Berkeley students did in showing the structure of this prison, of this notorious prison, where the Trump administration sent hundreds of Venezuelan men?
For both my students and myself, I think it was really probably the best word I can use is upsetting to see the conditions in which these men were being held. I know that the narrative circulating around them was that they were among the worst of the worst and that they were really vicious individuals. But what we saw, regardless of that, which I think we now know from the Human Rights Watch report, in many instances just was not true, was that the conditions were not conditions that would be consistent with international minimum standards for how people are held in detention facilities. For example, there was a place where men would be held with a tremendous degree of sensory deprivation, meaning no light. There was no natural source of light. It was incredibly dark in there. And one of the things that we could find from these influencer videos was just that people had bare concrete to sleep on. One of the things that we found was the water sources in some of these cells was so contaminated that there was just one source of water for these men to access. The men, we later knew from the Human Rights Watch report, were often drinking the same water that they were using for bathroom facilities, for washing and cleaning themselves, for cleaning their cells. So it was likely very contaminated. All of this was very consistent when we looked at the actual built infrastructure of these facilities with what these men said they had endured while in captivity.
In November, Human Rights Watch and Christosol, this is what you're talking about, released a report supported by your investigations lab titled "You've Arrived in Hell, Torture and Other Abuses Against Venezuelans in El Salvador's Mega Prison," based on interviews with 40 of the men who were ultimately released from SECAT. Democracy Now! Spoke with the report's authors. This is Noah Bullock, Executive Director of Christosol.
One of the conclusions we make is that torture is institutionalized in Salvadoran prisons. It's a state policy. It's almost as if the prison guards operate on a protocol. It's impossible that this is the actions of bad guards or bad apples. People were subjected to beatings almost daily. Upon arrival, they were beaten. When they asked for food and water, they were beaten. When they asked for medical care on the way to the clinic, they were beaten. They were often denied food, water, clothing as basic hygiene as a tool of punishment or reprisals. And in the case of the report, we also showed how the Venezuelans resisted and protested the beatings, but then were subjected again to more beatings. There was a punishment cell called the Island in their module where a tiny space, a solitary confinement cell where they were taken and beaten regularly. They would be deprived for hours of food and water, or in some cases days. And even, sadly, we were documented cases of sexual abuse. And it's important to note that the testimonies were consistent across 40 different individuals who gave testimonies. We were able to document and corroborate their testimonies with photographic evidence that was assessed by independent forensic experts.
So that was the head of Christosol who worked with Human Rights Watch. And you can